All right, so here we go. So this was an extremely long unit, basically spanning one miniature module at the beginning of the quarter, and then the longer, more detailed module about the West and everything. So the first module on Africa, and then the module on the East, and then also Latin America. So we'll check that out. We'll go all the way back and we'll start with Africa first, right? So here, our goals here, and you should recognize these from your KBAT sheets, right? We need to define imperialism, and we want to see why imperialism was successful, why it happened, what the reasons were, and what they were kind of, what Europeans were looking for in Africa during this time, right? So what is imperialism? Right, so it's one country kind of extending their influence over another, right? And sphere of influence is kind of an important word that we had in the in your KBAT sheet too. Sphere of influence meaning we use that terminology all throughout world history, and then you will see it again in U.S. history when you take that in the 11th grade. So it's kind of an important idea about basically controlling or severely or significantly influencing another area. And that also goes back to the assignment that we did based on cultural diffusion, where we talk about, that sphere of influence also allows you to affect culture, right? So one of the greatest things that I used to talk about students as far as that cultural influence and that cultural diffusion is the fact that McDonald's is in almost every country really around the world. That is, it's most of the countries that are in the UN, right? So, and you see that diffusion of the idea of McDonald's, of that fast meal, of that fast food. And then you see also the confluence of culture when you look at the different kinds of foods that you get, all around the world that you obviously would not get in America. So it's interesting to see that kind of intersection of culture and cultural diffusion around the world, right? So we're looking at mostly European nations. Right, especially in Africa, we're looking at European nations, and then when we move to Latin America, obviously we're going to talk about the U.S. But it's pretty much the big heavy hitters from Europe are colonizing. You're looking at this period where there's this everyone is desirous of having more money, more influence, mercantilistic policies where you have a positive trade balance with other nations, and you are the idea that there is a finite amount of money in the world, and you want to hoard as much of it as you can. And so when they could not acquire any more territory in Europe, they obviously didn't want to go to war anymore. They've been through some wars, and then we go through 100-year period or so in between the last big wars, post French Revolution, post Napoleonic Wars. We go through a significant amount of time before we get to World War I, in which you do have a time of relative peace. And it's because these European nations, instead of going after land in Europe and going after each other, they're now going after this land that's far easier to get a hold of. And once the scientific revolution brings in better ways of sailing, better ways of navigation, then you have this this push to go out and get the easy money, basically, is what it is, because you're going to these places that are not technologically advanced, they are not industrialized. And so obviously, thinking about what you learned in middle school, it's a lot easier when you have a gun and when you have cannons and those sorts of things to take over places where people are still fighting with spears. I mean, it's just simple as that. The old saying, right? Don't bring a knife to a gunfight. And that's exactly what happens. And so you have it's easy, like I said, easy money. And so they're going out and they're getting that easy money, especially in Africa, because they are mostly undiscovered, these areas, and they're already kind of fighting amongst themselves, right? So it's in Africa. We're going to talk about the Middle East. We're going to talk about Southeast Asia. Then we're going to talk about the Caribbean and Latin America. But right now, our focus is Africa until we get there. Okay, so the big reason, like I said, is economic, right? You're looking for resources to, you're looking at resources to help build your nation, right? Because industrialization, the nature of industrialization means that you need more resources to build more things, right? So, and the rapid nature of industrialization means that you need more and more of these resources. And so you're going out to places, and not only you're getting more resources easier, but you're also getting resources that you don't find in Europe. And so you're getting all those wonderful things that, that you didn't get. Also crops, right? Things were brought back into Europe, became part of the staple diet that were not grown in Europe. And so they had to continually get them from other places, right? And of course, new markets to sell their products, right? So as you are pulling in those raw materials, and this goes back to the previous ideas of imperialism as well, you have a place that you have a market for your products and you have the raw materials coming to you. This, you guys, if probably the most recent thing that you would remember as far as your middle school is, that relationship between England and the colonies in the United States, or what, previous to the United States, that they were only allowed to trade with England. So they're sending back all this raw material, and the only things that they can buy are the things that England is producing. So you have that easy market and cheap labor, cheap workers, those fun things. Strategic locations, right? So you're looking at setting up defenses from other countries, invasions from other countries around the world, just like, the Pearl Harbor port in Hawaii. And then you have, it's strategy to keep you safe, especially as other countries are going out. You have to then, even if you really weren't into imperialism, if you really weren't into going out and engaging with these other cultures, because everyone else is doing it, then you therefore have to do it as well, because you are at a significant strategic disadvantage if you don't go out and take over some places too and grab some colonies. Power and prestige, simple as that. I mean, that's a no-brainer. And once again, those rivalries, right? You have to maintain that defense. And then the idea that you have a moral responsibility as the industrialized nation to help to spread industrialization and help these other nations to become more like you, which, as you probably know, some of these nations and many of these nations did not want to be more like industrialized Europe. Yet, with the push, that's going to be the case. And the idea in the minds of the Europeans is that we have a moral responsibility to spread our ideals around the world. That's it's kind of like that forced cultural diffusion, right? And your belief system that, social Darwinism, we talked about that a little bit, where it's your responsibility to, take over and rule these weaker people, these people that you believe to be weaker people, obviously based on, just the fact that you're industrialized and they're not. Obviously, a significant amount of racism, thinking that the white Anglo-Saxon Christian race is the superior and should indeed be in charge of everything. So that's those reasons. Why was it so successful so quickly? And as I said before, if you have questions, let me know. I'm moving quickly because none of this is new material. We just want to see it again before we get that test and the chance for you to ask questions if you come across something that you don't understand, right? Non-Western empires. So these places, we have gone through, previously to this course, even previously to the course in Europe, you've gone through already these ages of significant corruption that have caused these wars that have not necessarily completely ended corruption, but made it to where internal corruption is not bringing down these empires. Like at some point, the Ottoman Empire is easily the strongest empire in the world. They avoided corruption in many different ways for a long period of time, but eventually, of course, corruption sneaks in everywhere. And the Ottomans suffered rapidly because as they were facing the Ottomans in the Middle East, and as well the Qing dynasty in China, you have them facing these internal dilemmas at the same time that these Western empires are becoming so powerful. And so the Ottomans, the Mughals, the Qing dynasty in China, they lose power rapidly because of these, the massive industrialization of Europe. At the same time, it's an unlucky time to be internally conflicted, right? And then Western African kingdoms, right? So anytime you have that internal struggle, and Africa's had internal tribal struggle. I mean, Africa is huge, and there is a plethora of small cultures, language barriers, and then that constant competition that has happened for hundreds, if not thousands of years on the continent. And so that makes them easy to divide and conquer, right? And so that's what happens. And then one of the Western advantages, right? So it's all that power. It's all the industrialization. They have, not just to say superior technology, significantly superior technology, right? And so they're crushing it. I mean, it's easy. It's really like like taking candy from a baby, right? It's just there, and you just go take it, and there's almost no resistance. And if there is resistance, it's put down so easily in most cases that it's not even a thing, right? So when you take over a place, how are you controlling that place? You have direct, you have indirect rule, right? So you're either in control specifically yourself, or you are convincing some of the native leaders that your ways are better ways and allowing them to take over ruling in your place. But of course, with your ideas, of course, with what you want going on. So basically, indirect rule is not that much different than direct rule. It just looks different because you have the natives that are doing that. Whereas in direct rule, it's just, you got troops, you got officials, you got people there. And a lot of times it starts off as indirect rule, and then something happens, something goes wrong to where you have to have that direct rule. You have protectorates, and then once again, that sphere of influence, right? It's how are you influencing these areas, and how are you using that influence to your advantage? And that's the whole deal, is using it to your advantage. As much as some of the missionaries would talk about their ideas of helping people, most of the times your governments that are initiating this, your companies such as the East India Company that are initiating these areas, these spheres of influence, it's purely for profit, purely for their benefit. And it's to even speak of really the humanitarianism is just such a small portion. All right, so the Berlin Conference, right? We did a couple of assignments and watched a couple of videos about the Berlin Conference. I think this is pretty simplistic. What you have is have those nations, you have your European nations that are meeting in, of course, Berlin. And what they're doing is legitimately just carving up Africa. They are drawing lines that have no regard for past history of who's in control, who's been in control, whose land it is, languages, different cultures. And like I said, there's thousands of languages, thousands of cultures on the African continent, and they have no regard for that. So they put people together that don't get along. They take over areas that have been ruled for long periods of time. And so it's very much so arbitrary. The way that they went about this is very much so arbitrary. They're just looking at a map and carving it up and saying, hey, this is yours, this is yours, this is yours, that's mine. And so it's it's an ineffective way to really divide up this area. And I know the one kind of adverse effect that we can talk about a lot is the Congo with Belgium, Prince Leopold, just using it as private play area, hurting the Congolese people so badly. If they had their rubber quotas, if they didn't reach their quotas, then they would cut off the hands of family members, because obviously you're not going to cut off the hand of the worker because then they can't work. So you have lots of women and children missing hands if they're not reaching their rubber quotas. And it was, especially Leopold was so horrible that even the rest of Europe was like, that's not cool. And so they actually took his colony from him by force because he was that awful. So that's just a prime example of the fact that it's just they did not even think these people were people. They treated them as animals, which is unfortunate, right? I clicked too many times. Anyway, so those are so you have long-term effects of the Berlin Conference even in the modern era, because Africa is still really not, they're still kind of reeling from this situation that was created by the Berlin Conference and then by the subsequent, post World War I, where we haven't got there yet, but post World War I, we're going to see a pullout of all these colonies. They're just going to leave, and they're going to leave destruction and disorganization in their wake. And these places, these peoples, these cultures are going to be fighting each other, and they still kind of, you have these warlords that have taken over these areas that even if, as European nations and America send in food and supplies, they just get stolen by these warlords and they never make it to the people. And so like you're talking like significant long-term effects just based out of that Berlin Conference. And so even after moving into Africa and the Middle East, you have Britain that are just pushing. They're just pushing to take over more and more area. At one point, Britain owns land just about everywhere in the world. I actually read something the other day. It was kind of a joke, but it said, out of I forget how many exactly are in the UN these days because it fluctuates constantly. But out of like the 162 members of the UN, Britain's invaded like 117 of them at some point in history. Because so Britain has always had, for such a very small place, they've always had extremely grandiose desires about taking over the world, basically. And they got mad at Germany for trying to do the same thing. What are you going to do, right? Anyway, so why is India so important? Suez Canal, ultra important because of that connection. And then what does India do as far as that's concerned? So basically, Britain kind of weasels their way into India in another similar fashion, in a way of that economic weasel. So that you have the British East India Company that has gone in there and then is taking these resources and getting as much as they can out of there. Is totally commercial interest at first, and then it's going to go poorly, right? So it's a private company. Once again, British East India Company is a private company. It's not the British government. This is a private company that goes in here and kind of slides in and realizes that some of the corruption in the Mughal Empire is they're waning, and so they're like, well, we can get in here and we can set up people and we can buy off people and we can have these people that are our working for us doing our bidding, and so then Britain, the East India Company goes in there, and at some point they're controlling 3/5 of India. They just have all this territory, all this area that is under their control, and they are it's not pleasant for the Indian people. It's not beneficial for them in most ways. But once again, clearly superior weaponry allows them to maintain that control. And so I guess an unfortunate idea on the part of the East India Company is to use these sepoys, these native soldiers, as employees, basically, right? So they're kind of doing the work of the East India Company, and obviously they're going to be unhappy because of the way things are going down. And so you get the Sepoy Rebellion, right? Rebelled against the British. So yes, some Sepoys massacred British civilians, but the way that the British put down this rebellion is horribly brutal. Once again, and not necessarily in the same fashion as Europe took notice of King Leopold in Belgium, but basically in a similar vein, taking notice was the rest of Western Europe, questioning how the British could be so harsh and destructive to a people that are really just trying to maintain their lifestyle, their way of life, and their benefits, the benefit of their country, the benefit of their land, right? So the rebellion spreads, and then it was a horrifying put down of this rebellion. And with that in mind, after this, right, so the British government, this is when the British government takes over and says, you can't do this. We can't have this kind of violence. We can't have the rest of Western Europe looking down on us like this. We can't have you destroying the products of our, of this imperialism. You can't kill all these people. You can't destroy all this land. You can't destroy these natural resources. And basically we can't have Britain looking bad by having, even though East India Company is a private company, we can't have Britain looking bad based on this massive rebellion. So Parliament sends troops. And then another thing that is quite, I guess, similar to the American colonists, the Indian people are taxed to pay for the troops that are keeping them in check. Very interesting, huh? So I don't know how they get away with all this stuff. It's craziness. And then we're going to see something similar, right? So you're going to notice similar, and we did an assignment on this too, but you're going to notice similarities in the way that countries enter all of these places. you're finding someone that is either already low on power or losing power, and you go in there and you swoop in and you take advantage of and kind of weasel your way in there economically, and then follow up with that more forceful rule, right? So Western powers want into China. China is huge, right? It's this huge country. They have a extremely large amount of people, and in some areas they have large amounts of resources, right, on the coast and somewhat in from the coast. But it's really also people. It's such cheap labor, and they make so much stuff. I mean, this is the fact that thinking about everything coming from China before, they've always made good products. They've always made good things. They've previous to this intervention, they were inventing pretty cool things. They were advanced for a nation, but once again, when you have this internal conflict, you have this waning power, and you have these other nations at the same time, unfortunately for China, once again, looking to expand that influence, looking to gain these territories, looking to gain those raw materials and cheap labor. It's an unfortunate recipe for disaster for those people, right? So start off with trading posts, and then just it grows from these very small trading posts on the coast. It grows into this massive undertaking of kind of weakening and destroying the Qing dynasty, and then looking at stealing, basically that's what it is, right? Stealing these resources and having these new markets. And so you see the British are here. And so it's not, France is in, this is Vietnam, the US and the Philippines, this is later, but you see that it's just not, it's a hop, skip, and a jump to think that we can squeeze China, whether it be together or whether it be, on our own. It's not a huge stretch to think, oh yeah, we can easily do this, right? And so taking over Singapore is important because, it sits in a controlling position that allows shipping, right? It's an easy way to get around. So here you have the Dutch East Indies, and then you have Britain. And so Britain controlling this area in these straits puts pressure on the Dutch, as well as the French, because of these shipping lanes. Rather than having to go here and here and here, you have that more direct route, just like the Panama Canal. When we're going to talk later about the US and Panama, that's an amazing feat to get that area and to make that canal, because it's all about shipping. It's all about saving time. It's all about being more safe. And so controlling that shipping lane is pivotal for Britain, so that they do put pressure on other countries, and it also allows them more unfettered access straight into these Chinese ports, and to that area of China that has the greatest amount of natural resources. So muy importante, right? And then we talked about France, talked about Netherlands, right? They're in there, they're looking for coffee, looking for spices, rubber, all these things that they're also looking for in Africa. You're looking for rubber, you're looking for gold, you're looking for diamonds. They're always looking for these resources that they don't have in the mainland or in their countries specifically. Spices are the most ridiculous thing that people wanted, even going back to overland trade between the East and Europe. Spices are important because, there's not great refrigeration, and it really enhances the flavors of food. So it's they're just looking for things that they don't have. And so you see that in all these countries we're talking about, it's that beginning of that economic kind of control, that economic foothold, and they're looking for things that they don't have in their own country, and then they're expanding that into more raw materials, more cheap labor, and more just sheer takeover of land. That's how we see that's a similarity in all of these that we're seeing as they go across into these nations, right? So just in general, you're seeing that diffusion of culture again, that push Christianity, Western customs, Western dress. Sometimes it's welcomed by certain places because they see it, I guess, as being better. And then sometimes obviously you have traditionalists who don't want that thing. So that's where you get a lot of that localized the people of these countries that are kind of, bickering and fighting, and that's weakening for them, right? So what are we getting from China? We're getting silk, we're getting tea, we're getting porcelain, right? And so I guess going back to the idea of mercantilism, right? You want a favorable balance of trade. So the British and other European nations are buying a lot of Chinese goods, and China's not buying a lot of goods because they make all this stuff. They have a ton of things there. They have no desire for these other things. And so you have this clearly unbalanced trade. And so, of course, what else is Britain going to do? They're going to figure out a way to balance that trade and push it into the favor of the British. And unfortunately did this via opium, which is a pretty addictive and pretty unpleasant withdrawal from it. It's a narcotic. You can compare it if you don't know anything about opium. You can compare it in your mind to heroin if you might know something more about heroin. But you can see these political cartoons as the British are kind of just forcing the opium upon the Chinese people, and you really don't have to force it. Once you get it in there, it is a drug, right? And so they're going to want more and more of it. Just like saying that we get drugs from Latin America in the modern era. They're not forcing the drugs up here. Like there's a demand for that supply, and so it's the same thing there. And then of course China sees that their people are becoming addicted to this drug, and it's bad for their people. It's bad for business overall, and so they try to stop it. And then you get the opium wars, and of course China is not in any fashion able to fend off the British. And so the British, not only do they set up exclusive trade in certain areas, but they come to the agreement that the British don't even have to follow any Chinese laws, which is, so it's obvious that there's a clear imbalance in power. And then once again, so everyone else jumps on the bandwagon, right? France, Germany, Russia, US, and Japan all gain exclusive areas for trade. That is their sphere of influence. And once again, along with the fact that the citizens of these countries that are in China don't have to follow Chinese rule. So it's almost like you could think about it as a diplomatic area, that they don't have to, but it's all over China that they don't have to follow their rules, which is obviously unfortunate. So like we said, like I've been saying, it's all about the economic interests of Europeans. You're bringing Christianity over there. It does not really take hold. Buddhism and Confucianism are still the main religions in China to this day. But you do see the changing of cultures. You see the changing of customs. You see that cultural diffusion. And then I know when we do this today, not today, last week, that China pie discussion, as you have, this Germany, England, and Japan, as the Chinese are back here watching them divide up China. So that's basically, what's up. Okay, so once again, you're looking at the Taiping Rebellion. This is another one of those things that's weakening the Qing dynasty, the Qing government. And so as you can see here, so after the rebellion, the Qing dynasty has to share governing power with regional warlords, which of course divides that power. And even those warlords are going to want more. And so you have that effect towards that. And that weakening of the Qing dynasty is obviously what's going to bring in and make it easier for the Westerners to come in with their technology, with their industry, and then the promise of Western education for those that support them, right? So, the Qing dynasty loses. You have the Japanese coming in, the Sino-Japanese War. When you see the word Sino, that refers to China. So this is really the Chinese-Japanese War. The Chinese are the Qing dynasty is reeling. They're continually losing. And then you get, so in order to try and maintain at least some semblance of power and try to appeal to these people that want modernization, you have the 100 Days of Reform, which you're looking at a modernization or to promote the modernization of China, right? So it was not good, right? Didn't go very well. But what you end up with is the results of all this is that open door policy. So the U.S. comes in and with that might, with the way that the Qing dynasty has already been reeling, they just basically state that, here we are, we have all of this power, we have this military, and you're just going to do what we tell you, and you're open now. Trade is happening, and you can't stop it. So it's pretty uncool, right? Pretty uncool. And then in the desire to force out all foreigners, you have the righteous and harmonious fist, also known as the Boxers, right? They try to push everyone out. And then what that really does is makes it even worse for the King government, because you basically have, when we talk about a multinational military force, you have all these countries, Russia, France, England, America, Japan, all these countries that are trading with China that want that trade in there. And so the Boxers are trying to force everyone out. And that just causes everyone to kind of even more so gang up with more unity on China. Not cool. Didn't work out very well for them. But you do see we're getting some of that greater amount of cultural diffusion. All right, so let's talk about Japan, right? So for the longest period of time, Japan completely isolated themselves, didn't let anybody in other than Japanese. And then with some governmental political changes, they realized it's pretty cool to kind of see, once they realize that these Western powers are being so successful, then maybe adopting some of those ways is going to be good for them. So old school was a feudalistic system, shoguns with samurai as the warriors, the shoguns being the feudal leaders. So it's this is outdated as far as the way the rest of the world is operating, right? For the most part, except for certain parts of Russia. But you begin to see, right? So the Dutch are allowed access to trade one time a year. Even any economic foothold, anything that you can kind of get your toe in the door is always going to be a situation where you can try to push for more significant economic power and economic trade. Okay, so you have Matthew Perry, not the one who started Friends, definitely a different one, with power granted by Millard Fillmore, who was president at the time, coming in there with the demand for diplomatic and commercial exchange. Once again, same thing with China, right? They come in and say, like, this is an open door now. And so it's a similar idea, but with all that power, as demonstrated by, the fleet, the Japanese see really no way, they're not going to win a war. And so they have to sign the old treaty, right? And get some trading, get once again that foothold is in the door. And so you get more and more like the fixing up, the support of specific leadership and the help. And so you get the Meiji modernizing and strengthening Japan, adapting to Western ways. Once again, and we're seeing it again. We're seeing that cultural diffusion. And really a lot of that cultural diffusion, as we will see over the next, quarter, these Western ways are going to cause a lot of problems as we, are getting into World War I, but they're strengthening these areas of the world as well. Obviously, here we are in 1850s. We're talking about, between 1850 and 1900, the significant push into Japan and China, Japan becoming a major power because they're westernizing and because they're smartly going about, getting this information and this technology. But then we're going to see, within 100 years, Japan's, trying to take over part of the world, right? So there's lots of different, there's so many layers of consequences of this greed that Europeans have coming in there, right? And so you get what becomes a more powerful, Japanese government. So the Japanese are one of the only countries to defeat Russia ever, right? And we're talking about, 40 years since the first when in 1853 we're talking about them dipping their toe in there, we're talking about 40 years later. Japan rapidly takes this idea and uses it to their advantage. And we've talked a ton about cultural diffusion, right? So cultural diffusion, it's just the exchange of culture. Usually it's by force at first, and in this manner with imperialism, right? And you see the effects changing around the world at the same time, changing of the original culture, like talking about things like kebab in England, right? Obviously that comes from the East. And so you're bringing stuff back to your country and you're sending stuff, ideas, foods, economic practices, military practices, governmental practices. It's being traded back and forth, these ideologies between countries just from this imperialistic connection. So that's a ton of important information. But like I said, I'm going rapidly because we've seen all this before. I just want to remind everyone and refresh our memories, especially of the older stuff. Right now, we're moving into more stuff that's fairly recent, as we go into Latin America. But most of that stuff was, it was a while ago. And so I wanted to kind of go over this again and make sure that, everyone was ready to rock and roll with that. So let's talk about the U.S. imperialism. Let's talk about the U.S. growing their empire. And we're going to see a lot of that is, people talk about the joke of, they need democracy, that sort of thing. But the U.S. does kind of go into these areas with the guise of spreading what they call democracy, their brand of democracy, and kind of following the Monroe Doctrine and keeping the West for the U.S., right? So we're going to buy Alaska from Ruska, or Russia, depends, words are tough, I get it. But it's called Seward's Folly. Obviously, it worked out pretty well because oil, right? Oil is good for making money, right? If you think about it, and we might talk about it at some point in the near future, but as we get into the modernization of Russia, we'll see that the ineptitude of Russia's ruling class and ruling elites is really hidden well by the fact that they had so much oil that they could literally rule so horribly and still have enough money to support their people. But when the oil money started to run out, that's when the USSR kind of fell. So Republic of Hawaii, obviously we know Hawaii has a lot of resources that we currently use: pineapple, sugarcane, lots of same reasons that we wanted in the Caribbean, the rum, the sugarcane, those sorts of things. And so this is kind of an orchestrated revolt by businessmen, like the Dole Corporation per se, right? Those people are the ones who are causing this unrest in this island nation that obviously has no way to defend itself against such a power as the U.S. So, they locked down the Queen. As you see, Sanford Dole is named president of Hawaii. I mean, you've all had Dole pineapple, right? It's all political. It's all economic. The fruits, it's really good for growing those tropical fruits. Whaling, which we don't do anymore, but was very lucrative at the time, and sugarcane. And obviously strategic because it's a strategic place for defense, even though we didn't do so well in World War II with using it for that defense. But yeah, so we get lots of benefits for the U.S. The Spanish-American War, I don't really want to talk that much about that because it's all about the U.S. using this guise of war to gain influence. It's hard to believe that at one point the U.S. controlled Cuba, isn't it? It was a protectorate. But with everything that goes on in Cuba and has been going on in Cuba with communism, but it's hard to believe that at one time it was a U.S. protectorate. But you're talking about the same thing. Looking for tobacco, looking for sugarcane, looking for rum, looking for the cheap labor. All those things are why the U.S. wants to enter Latin America, why the U.S. wants to enter the Caribbean. Because, unless you're in the southern tip of Florida and the Keys, most of this stuff doesn't grow anywhere in America. And people like this stuff, right? People like sugar. People like the rum. They like the cheap labor. They like pineapple. They like those fruits. They like those tropical things. And so it's, they want it. And so instead of trying to set up some sort of trade with them, we're just going to enter a sphere of influence relationship with them. And that way we can push them to give us what we want as cheap as possible. So we gain Cuba, we gain Puerto Rico, Guam, and the Philippines. And you know that all we have left now is Puerto Rico and Guam. But that was something we gained from that war. But it was literally a strictly, I mean, war is political, but it was an economic based war searching for more influence. Okay, so one of the last things we're going to talk about is the Panama Canal. So they were looking for that way to open up those shipping lanes. And so they find this, just the smallest area. So if you look at a map of Central America, right, the smallest area that you have to dig out is Panama. And so, you know, we convinced them to give us this area in order to dig. And by convincing them, we help them to rebel against our government, and then our government that we install gives us this access. And as you can see, it's a pretty significant savings of time, right? 8,000 miles. Right, completed in 1914. It's pretty cool. It does a great job, although with modern ships, it's not as useful as it used to be because modern ships are so large. And then we gave Panama the control of the canal zone back about 20 years ago. Everyone was kind of surprised when it happened because no one expected the US to actually give it back, but they did. So also important is the Roosevelt corollary to the Monroe Doctrine, right? So Monroe Doctrine wants to keep European nations out of the affairs of the Western Hemisphere. It's like, you guys are having problems over there in Europe, you stay over there, we're over here. It was almost like an isolationist policy. We just wanted us and this whole hemisphere, leave it to America, right? But then the Roosevelt corollary is that we have the right to intervene and keep the peace in this half of the world. So that is where, so suppose you can say, oh, these guys over here are fighting, we need to go in there, we need to keep the peace. That's where that joke about, oh, that nation, they have oil, they need democracy. That's where that kind of joke, that ideal comes from, just the fact that we have the right to intervene and keep the peace. And I'd like to reiterate, the US is just stating these things. It's no, hey, let's have a meeting with these nations and see if they want. No, they're just like, this is what it is. Open door policy, China, this is the way it is. Roosevelt corollary, this is the way it is. We have the right to do this. Because, and the idea is that any kind of unrest threatens the sanctity and sovereignty of the United States. That's how they kind of play it off. And there you go. There's Roosevelt. That's Teddy Roosevelt. One of the things he said was you walk tall and you carry a big stick. And that's, you know, that's them kind of taking over the Caribbean. And you see debt collection. So that's another method of inserting yourself is to have that negative trade imbalance or negative trade balance with a nation. And then they owe you so much money that you start taking over places. And then we're not going to talk about Mexico because that's very, very recent. So that was a whole lot of stuff. And once again, that is all stuff that we've talked about. And that really covers almost everything that's going to be on that exam. So anybody have questions? Questions, comments or questions?